All right, the top story at this hour comes in from the United States, where U.S. Senators Shaheen and Elizabeth Warren have urged the Trump administration to end sanctions relief on Russian oil and not renew the Treasury General License 134B. They argue that the policy allows Russia to generate additional revenue from oil sales while offering no real relief to the American consumers facing high fuel prices. Now, the senators further claim that the current approach is counterproductive and have accused Donald Trump's policy direction of indirectly enabling Russia amid broader geopolitical tensions. With that, let's in fact take a look at the sanctions waiver scenarios. So, we'll take you through what all can actually happen in this particular situation, because the senators are seeking that this waiver be lifted. However, there is also a certain amount of pressure that is there on the Trump administration to extend the waivers that have been granted to Russian oil. So, let's look at what the scenarios are. Let's look at the first scenario, which is if sanctions are lifted, then there will be lower global oil prices in the short term, obviously. Because we are looking at Russia supplying oil over there to various countries that are currently facing a fuel crisis because the Strait of Hormuz remains to be blocked. There is a naval blockade by the US. Iran also has in fact stated that currently the situation remains very tense in the Strait of Hormuz. So, because of that, countries across the globe have seen a shortage in fuel. They are facing a fuel crisis. If Russia's waivers are allowed, the waivers on the Russian oil are allowed to extend, then some countries might get relief. There will also be increased Russian supply, which will flood the market, easing spikes from Iran conflict. So, remember that this all started when the Iran war actually started. So, on February 28, when the US-Israel war first started, after that in March, the sanctions waiver came into the picture, because US was obviously looking at making sure that there are alternate arrangements in place for the world to look towards for oil supply, and that was Russia. So, this is the first scenario. You will see that there will be easing of tensions and easing of the crisis in various countries if Russian oil is allowed to be taken by other countries, if the waivers stay in place, and they will also flood the market. Now, let's look at the second scenario. If the sanctions are reinstated. Now, remember that the tighter Russian revenue squeeze. So, if what happens if the waiver relief period is in fact lifted, then there will be tighter Russian revenue squeeze, because they will not have this sort of revenue that they were in fact getting because of the sale of Russian oil and Russian crude. India is also one of the countries that continues to seek Russian oil, which is at sea or which they have purchased earlier and has been already boarded on tankers that India is in fact still getting. So, that has helped ease a little bit of the energy crisis. But if the waivers are lifted, what will happen is there will be lesser revenue for Russia, and also lower export volumes and wider discount cuts criminal oil income significantly. So, this will in fact significantly affect the revenue over there also. Now, if sanctions are lifted, let's look at some more scenarios. If the sanctions are lifted, it will be a boost to Russian revenues. If in fact the sanctions and the waivers are still in, if the waivers are still given, and Putin gains billions more for war budget via higher volumes and reduced discounts. So, Putin in fact will get more revenue, and what others and senators in the US are also saying that he might use this revenue to fund the war against Ukraine, which is going on since the past 3 to 4 years. So, this is the main bone of contention that is coming to the fore, that Putin will keep putting this and increasing the war budget that he has. Now, if sanctions are reinstated, if they continue to implement the sanctions, if that waiver that was given is not extended, there will be higher global oil prices. Obviously, because the only alternate source that the world was looking towards because of this Iran crisis will in fact then be there will be no other alternative. So we look at higher global oil prices, and also reduced supply pushes Brent higher, raising costs for consumers and inflation risk. Now remember that since there will be reduced supply from Russia, from Iran, from the Middle East also, then what will happen is the prices of oil will further increase, and that will obviously affect the pockets of the consumers. But apart from that, inflation, because there will be an indirect effect on a lot of sectors, so inflation also will increase further. Now let's look at how India and Asia will benefit if the sanctions are lifted, if there are still waivers on the Russian oil sanctions. And the major buyers they are, and they will secure cheap crude, stabilizing their economies and also refining. So we will get, in fact, Asia, India, they will get cheap crude, obviously because Russia is offering it at a lower discount. That will help us also stabilize our economy, which are currently facing a fuel crisis because of the West Asia conflict. However, if the sanctions are reinstated, then there will be a pressure on buyers like India, and there will be a shift to costlier alternatives, potential shortages or higher import bills. So let's look at the scenarios if the supply chain is disrupted again. If we do not have Russia again in the picture, we will have to pay more, because we look at costlier alternatives like the Venezuelan fuel. We have only one refinery that can process it, so higher the cost of fuel consumption, it will go up. We look at higher inflation as well. We look at a higher import bill, because we are going to look for newer alternatives. So obviously a lot of ramifications over there if the sanctions are reinstated. Now let's look at if sanctions against are lifted. Criticism and alliance strain there will be by Ukraine allies accuse US of funding the Russian invasion and weakening sanctions regime. So obviously there is a lot of criticism among the American public as well, and also US lawmakers who are stating that this back and forth on the sanctions front has in fact weakened the position of America itself. Let's look at the next scenario. If sanctions are reinstated, there will be a stronger Ukraine support signal. Allies view it as a firm stance against Russia, possibly aiding the peace talks. So remember that the allies like NATO, like the European partners of US, are always seeking that these sanctions remain on Russia, because they want the Ukraine-Russia war to finally end. They want the peace talks to in fact come into the picture, but that is not happening if Russia continues to face no sanctions, if Russia continues to get revenue from its oil supply. So that's what the partners or allies like European Union and NATO will want. Let's look at another scenario. If the sanctions are lifted, there will be a prolonged Ukraine war, like we have been mentioning. Extra funds help Russia sustain the military effort longer because they can increase their war budget in turn. Then they will spend more on this war against Ukraine. However, if the sanctions are reinstated, there is a shadow fleet challenges that will come into the picture, increased enforcement costs and risks for Russian exports. So Russian exports will obviously face a risk if the sanctions are in fact reinstated over here. Let's look at market adaptation. If the sanctions are lifted, Russia reduces the shadow fleet reliance, long-term enforcement also weakens. Now, what are shadow fleets that we keep talking about? We also spoke about it in the previous slide. Shadow fleets are, remember, those oil tankers that are in fact moving across to various countries to supply oil. However, they are not the legal they are not going through the legal route. So these are shadow fleets that are trying to avoid maybe the sanctions that have been put in place. They have been trying to avoid whatever restrictions are put in place, and then they supply. So if Russia is providing a shadow fleet to a third country, that shadow fleet will be reduced if the sanctions in fact are lifted, because then legally Russia can provide oil to these third countries. All right. Now, let us look at if sanctions are reinstated, US domestic mixed impact. This will actually help US energy producers, but hurt the consumers at the pump. So, obviously, when there will be a mixed impact on the US consumers, because the cost of the oil will go up further, since there are no available alternatives available for them as well. Let me in fact go across to our guest who is joining us on this broadcast, Ambassador Gauri Shankar Gupta, who is a former diplomat. Thank you so much, sir, for taking out your time and for speaking to NewsX. A very good morning to you. Ambassador, this is a situation which seems to be a double whammy for the Trump administration, because on one hand they have to balance out the rising inflation, the fuel costs that keep cropping up. They seem to have no end in sight for the Iran war. So sanctions was a way to make sure that the entire global energy economy does not go into a spin. However, at the home front, they are facing a lot of criticism, Ambassador, because they are saying that this is the revenue that Russia is using to fuel the war against Ukraine, and it will keep going on if we do not in fact reimpose these sanctions on Russian oil. I want to understand from your expert observation as to what can be the next step for America, Ambassador.
Good morning, Shivani. You have given a very good analysis of various scenarios. So my job has become very simple now. Let me tell you, first thing is that this Ukraine-Russia war was actually fueled by US and NATO. They are the one who brought the so-called Orange Revolution, installed a puppet regime, and then they started this war. So the whole crisis was started by US, and as of now it appears that the crisis settled, because the territory which Russia has acquired, approximately 19% of Ukrainian territory, I don't think Russia will ever give up, and therefore it is a reality on the ground. The Ukraine has also indirectly accepted it. President Trump has already mentioned it many times, and therefore the war is coming to an end. I don't see any other consequence except Russia retaining this territory. And if the war continues, even then Ukraine has no chance of recovering this territory. They would in fact lose more. They have already lost a large part of their population, young population, in the war. Some of them have actually migrated. Almost 3 million people have migrated to other countries. So Ukraine is already in a big crisis. It's time that the war stops, and I feel that resources with Russia are not lacking if they want to continue the war. This is not the only source of Russian funding the war. They have other sources as well. So this is not the principal reason for continuing of the war. I think America should lift these sanctions, allow the global economies to grow, so that the economic depression which is now starting does not become very pervasive and very strong. That is very important. The second thing is that 22% or 25% of energy resources are not under supply or delivery to the world because of the crisis between Iran and US. Now that is also not of the making, that is the making of US once again. US and Israel invaded Iran, and because of that this crisis happened. There may be valid reasons for the invasion, I am not going into those reasons, but the fact is that because of this crisis the Strait of Hormuz remains blocked. if the 25% oil supply remains blocked, obviously there are not many other alternatives. India is already exploring all options, but is still not able to get enough supply at reasonable prices. I think this is the same situation with many other countries in Southeast Asia, in Europe, and they are having a sort of economic depression because of this region. I think this is time that US understand this and realizes that the war between Ukraine and Russia is practically over. The territory which Russia has acquired, let it remain with Russia and let the peace be established between the two nations. That is the only way, and the sanctions should be lifted on Russian oil so that the global economy does not become a victim of this, entire process. The effort should also be made now to start the navigation in the Persian Gulf. And the discussion between Beijing and Washington, I get an impression. I don't know how far they are true, but the two countries, according to the press, reports, have agreed that Iran should not have nuclear weapon. If that is the truth, and if that has been agreed to, I think the pressure can be mounted on Iran to agree to, not to enrich uranium further and surrender the 60% enriched uranium which is in its custody.
All
I
right.
think that can be done if the China has also agreed to that, and that will pave the way
Right.
for, global energy supply all over through the Persian Gulf.
All right. Thank you so much, Ambassador, for your perspective on this issue. With that, we are moving forward to some other news coming our way. Prime Minister Narendra Modi, in fact, arrived in the Netherlands on a Friday on the second leg of his five-nation diplomatic tour. And this is his second visit to the country after 2017. Modi received a very warm welcome at the Schiphol airport in Amsterdam and later in The Hague, including cultural performances by the Indian diaspora. There are in fact scheduled bilateral talks with the Dutch Prime Minister Rob Jetten in The Hague, focusing on trade, investment, semiconductors, clean energy, green hydrogen, water management, agriculture, defence and emerging technologies.